Chapter 1: The Great Awakenings and the Restoration Movement. Before Joseph Smith was ever born, before the Restoration claimed to restore anything, there was a wave of revival that shook the colonies to their core. Historians call it the First Great Awakening. It was one of the most important religious earthquakes in early American history. In the early 1700s, colonial churches looked respectable, orderly, and well-polished. Sermons were long, learned, and heavy with Enlightenment rationalism. Ministers emphasized morality, reason, and civic virtue. Religion was something you did. You went to church, you followed the rules, you paid your dues. But for many, it felt lifeless, cold, ritualistic, formal. Spiritual passion, the sense of a personal encounter with God, seemed absent. In places like Massachusetts, church membership was even declining, especially among younger generations, who didn't see the point of sitting through endless moral lectures. The tension boiled between respectable religion and a growing hunger for something more visceral, more emotional, and more real. When the dam finally broke in the 1730s, it came not from careful reform, but from fiery preaching, mass conversions, and gatherings that shocked the colonial establishment. At the heart of the awakening was the idea of the new birth. Salvation wasn't about being a member of the right church or living a decent life. It was about a personal, life-changing conversion. Preachers insisted you had to experience God for yourself, to feel the crushing weight of sin and the overwhelming relief of forgiveness. This message cut across class, age, and education. Religion became democratized. One name stands out: Jonathan Edwards, minister in Northampton, Massachusetts. Edwards wasn't flashy. He spoke in a steady, almost monotone voice, but his words, carefully reasoned yet piercing, cut deep. His most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, 1741, described humanity dangling over the pit of hell like a spider over a fire, held up only by the thread of God's mercy. Some wept, some screamed, others collapsed in despair. Edwards argued that true religion was not ritual, but a transformed heart. A cold, outward Christianity was worthless. Only an inward rebirth mattered. Salvation was direct, personal, and urgent. If Edwards was the mind, George Whitefield was the thunder. An English Methodist preacher, Whitefield toured the colonies in the 1740s, and his arrival was like a religious rock concert. His booming voice could be heard by tens of thousands in open fields. Benjamin Franklin once confirmed this. Whitefield preached with drama and passion, using gestures, tears, and booming cadences. His message was simple: you must be born again. Farmers left their plows, merchants closed their shops, whole towns turned out. He connected the colonies, creating a shared experience and a sense that the revival was continental, sowing seeds for a common identity that would later influence the American Revolution. Not everyone welcomed the revivalists. Gilbert Tennant, a Presbyterian from New Jersey, charged that too many ministers were spiritually dead, preaching empty words without experiencing conversion themselves. Congregations split. Some sided with the fiery New Light preachers, others clung to their Old Light pastors. Whole denominations fractured. The awakening questioned whether formal training and church office mattered if someone lacked a true conversion. It was a leveling force: ordinary people versus the educated elite. The awakening left enormous consequences. Churches split into New Lights and Old Lights, often bitterly, weakening traditional authority but opening space for diversity. Thousands experienced conversion, and denominations like the Baptists and Methodists swelled, spreading rapidly, especially on the frontier. New colleges sprang up to train revival-friendly ministers: Princeton, Dartmouth, and Brown. Ironically, institutions of higher learning grew out of a movement that distrusted formal clergy. The awakening cemented a style of Protestantism defined by personal faith, the authority of Scripture, and missionary zeal. By stressing that everyone stood equal before God, it planted seeds of political equality and a spirit of questioning authority that would echo in the Revolution. The First Great Awakening shattered colonial calm, democratized spiritual authority, and gave birth to an evangelical culture that still shapes American life. Ordinary people didn't need church elites to encounter God. It built networks that tied the colonies together while leaving behind broken congregations, theological disputes, and a pattern of religious conflict. When Joseph Smith appeared a century later, claiming visions and revelations, he stepped into a tradition already shaped by Edwards, Whitefield, and Tennant, where fiery preaching, personal conversion, and challenges to authority had long taken root. By the end of the 18th century, the spiritual pulse of America was strangely uneven. In the old towns of New England and the Mid-Atlantic, church-going was a matter of habit, often more about respectability than encounter with God. But out in the wilderness, the cut-over forests of western New York, the clearings along the Ohio, the scattered cabins of Kentucky, life was raw and uncertain. Churches were few, ministers even fewer, and many families lived months without hearing a sermon. In this vacuum, a hunger stirred. People longed not for orderly sermons, but for a God who seemed as immediate as the storms that lashed their cabins or the wolves that howled at night. It was here, in this unsettled country, that the camp meeting was born. One early settler remembered the shock of it. A vast concourse had met beneath the foliage of the trees. The skies alone, draped with clouds by day and adorned with stars by night, could form the covering. Families came from 50 miles or more, rattling along muddy roads in wagons or on horseback, carrying provisions, bedding, and children. When they arrived, they joined a strange forest city. Rows of rough shelters made of logs, brush, and canvas, with fires burning and kettles hanging from makeshift poles. By day, the sound of axes echoed as men cleared spaces, raised brush arbors, or repaired wagons. By night, torchlight glowed against the trunks of tall oaks, throwing flickering shadows across the mass of tents. Methodist preacher Nathan Bangs described his first sight of such a meeting in 1805. Booths were constructed of the boughs of trees, at night, illuminated by pine torches, thronged by thousands of worshippers. The primeval forest presented a poetic and indescribable interest. He was a practical man, trained to record miles ridden and sermons preached, but even he could not hide his awe. Something about the scale, the thousands gathered, the music and firelight, the thunder of voices lifted in prayer, gave the meetings a sense of cosmic drama. These were not quiet affairs. A visitor to a New York camp meeting in 1805, an Englishman more accustomed to polite Anglican services, reported astonishment at the seats for about 4,000 people, the 200 tents, and the sheer energy of the people. The worship continued 4 days and nights without intermission. Light and glory appeared to fill the camp both day and night. To him it seemed unearthly, a religious carnival unmatched in the old world. The sounds of a camp meeting were unforgettable. As one critic in the Christian Observer put it, sometimes with disapproval, the gatherings echoed with stamping, bouncing, jumping and falling, crying and howling, groaning and sighing, rude singing, accompanied by clapping of hands or beating of time with the foot. But even his mocking description betrays the overwhelming physicality of it all. For ordinary settlers, the meetings were nothing short of a lifeline. In the diary of David Daly, a Methodist preacher, he recalled an 1819 meeting on Tangier Island where rainstorms lashed the gathering. Much rain, still, the people sang and prayed on, without abatement. It is easy to picture, wet clothes clinging to bodies, children huddled in shelters, fires sputtering, yet hymns rising into the storm. The devotion was not easily quenched. Children remembered the sounds vividly. The wail of a sinner struck to the ground by conviction, the shouts of joy as someone declared forgiveness, the crackle of pine knots tossed into the fire. Women carried babies on their hips while singing. Men knelt in mud and wept. One boy recalled falling asleep to a confused but solemn sound of prayer and singing, like the ocean beating against a shore. The meetings lasted for days, sometimes a week. Preachers rotated, often without rest, voices hoarse from pleading with sinners. Some were ordained, but many were circuit riders, Methodist or Baptist ministers who traveled hundreds of miles each year, carrying little more than a Bible, saddlebag, and change of clothes. They were hardened to the wilderness, often sleeping in barns or on dirt floors, rising at dawn to ride another 20 miles. They lived with the same roughness as their flocks, and for that reason they were trusted. Their sermons had no polished elegance, but they spoke with fire, urgency, and familiarity. Preachers often called for mourners to come forward, to kneel in the straw and weep their sins before God. One traveler wrote of seeing rows of men and women prostrate in the dust, crying aloud for mercy. At night, when fires lit the encampment and shadows flickered across faces, the scene could feel almost apocalyptic. Thousands crying out, voices overlapping, sobs mingling with hymns. These were not isolated spectacles. They shaped communities. A man who had traveled 50 miles to a Kentucky meeting in 1801 remembered entire families rising changed. Whole neighborhoods, on returning, became as if newly inhabited. Taverns emptied, feuds ended, prayer meetings sprang up in cabins. For the poor farmer, the bond laborer, the young wife, the enslaved African, the revival offered not just spiritual assurance but dignity, the sense that one's voice mattered before God. The camp meeting was also profoundly democratic. Men and women prayed side by side. Poor farmers preached with the same authority as learned ministers. Women, long excluded from formal church authority, found visible and active roles here. Revival meetings created spaces where women could pray aloud, testify publicly, organize gatherings. One young woman recorded in her journal the thrill of her first public prayer. My voice trembled, but as I continued, strength came, and I felt as though heaven itself were listening. Though still bound by cultural restraints, women found in revival a space to act, to testify, to shape their community's spiritual life. Enslaved men and women found in the revival an intensity of feeling and promise of liberation that institutional churches denied them. Some joined Methodist and Baptist congregations, which offered a degree of equality rare elsewhere. Others gathered in their own meetings, blending evangelical fervor with rhythms of African song and storytelling. One white observer in Virginia confessed, half admiring, half alarmed, that the Negroes, when seized by conviction, shout with such vehemence that the ground seems to shake. Some African Americans carried fragments of Methodist and Baptist revival into their own clandestine gatherings, blending evangelical fervor with rhythms of African song and memory. In such moments, the revival carried both liberation and danger, the promise of a God who listened to all, and the threat of a power that unsettled earthly hierarchies. The critics, of course, abounded. Local elites sometimes worried that the meetings undermined authority, that farm labor was neglected for days, or that social order was threatened by the mixing of classes. Diaries and newspapers confirm both the grip and the controversy of this new faith. A Kentucky woman named Margaret McDowell wrote in 1801 of a gathering where the noise was like the roar of Niagara. The vast sea of human beings seemed to be agitated, as if by a storm. I counted 7 ministers, all preaching at one time, some on stumps, others in wagons, and one standing on a tree which had in falling lodged against another. In the same year, a skeptical doctor visiting a camp meeting in Cane Ridge described seeing hundreds struck to the ground in convulsions. The scene to me was new and passing strange. The falling exercise was most generally prevalent. He could hardly believe his eyes, yet he admitted the devotion was real. Such accounts spread quickly through print. Religious newspapers eagerly published reports of conversions, while secular presses often mocked the enthusiasm. The Albany Register in 1804 ran a piece complaining of the confused uproar of bawling, singing, shouting, and screaming. The Kentucky Gazette in 1801 described with mingled amazement and suspicion the vast Cane Ridge meeting, reporting that the multitudes assembled are beyond number, and their exercises of devotion attended with cries, swoons, and shoutings that rend the air. Accounts like this circulated eastward, where city readers shook their heads or leaned in with curiosity, feeding both fascination and ridicule. But curiosity drew readers in, and the fame of the revivals only grew. One New Englander dismissed the revivals as a contagion of the nerves. Yet the movement spread inexorably. By the 1820s, the camp meeting was the dominant form of revival in the frontier. Methodist and Baptist numbers soared. Their strength lay not in educated clergy or great institutions, but in sheer mobility and emotional power. As one Methodist writer put it bluntly, "Our people will go where the people are. They will preach in barns, in woods, in cabins, wherever souls can be saved." The men who carried this revival across the countryside were not polished professors or ecclesiastical dignitaries. They were circuit riders, men on horseback who carved long loops through unsettled country, visiting cabins, schoolhouses, barns, and fields where small clusters of families waited to hear the word of God. The Methodist system thrived on this model, sending young men, often barely older than their hearers, to preach wherever there were ears to listen. Their lives were brutal in their simplicity. They rose before dawn, rode through mud and snow, crossed rivers swollen with spring melt, slept in borrowed beds or on cabin floors, and often went without pay or even steady food. Yet their journals tell us they considered these deprivations the price of a higher calling. One Methodist writer in Kentucky recorded that he swam rivers, slept in the woods, preached with my clothes frozen stiff, and endured hunger and cold, yet felt the joy of God's Spirit sustaining me. Another described the people's hunger for words of comfort, recounting that a settler pressed him to stay the night and preach the next morning, saying, "Sir, we are as sheep without a shepherd. Give us one sermon before you leave." Their routes spanned hundreds of miles, and their visits stitched scattered farms into fragile webs of religious life. A preacher might ride into a hollow and find a dozen people waiting on rough benches. The next week he could arrive at a clearing where hundreds had gathered from 20 miles in every direction. The pattern was never predictable, but the expectation was always the same. The preacher must speak as though heaven and hell were hanging in the balance. The words they brought did not stay confined to the pulpit. Families carried them home, repeating lines at their hearth fires, recalling gestures and tones, sometimes mimicking the very cadences of the traveling preacher as they told the stories again. Children overheard their parents describing the sermon with awe or trembling, and the words worked their way into dreams. Whole neighborhoods repeated the warnings of hellfire or the promises of grace until they became part of the common language of daily life. The Methodist circuit system created continuity where otherwise there would have been isolation. A writer might visit a settlement only once every few months, but in his absence, families continued to meet, to sing the hymns he had taught, to read from the Bible, and to testify of what they had experienced. When the writer returned, the community was ready, primed to burst with the stories of what had happened since his last visit. In this way, the revival did not simply burn bright and fade. It left embers in each settlement, embers that could flare again with the next arrival. For many of these communities, the revival was the most vivid and memorable event in their lives. Diaries recall the physical details as much as the spiritual ones. The flickering torchlight at night services, the sound of hymns echoing through the trees, the exhaustion of listening for hours on end, the taste of bread shared among families, the soreness from sitting on rough-hewn benches. Spiritual awakening was not a disembodied state, but a lived, sensory, communal experience, tied to the rhythms of frontier survival. Diaries left by ordinary settlers reveal the private face of this movement. A farmer's wife in western New York recorded that she attended a gathering where the preacher spoke so plain of sin that I could not raise my eyes. My heart beat with such force I thought I should fall down before all. Another settler wrote that after hearing a sermon on the prodigal son, he returned home and gathered his children around him, confessing aloud his neglect of prayer and swearing before them to change his ways. These private writings reveal how revival wove itself into the fabric of family life. Public display and private transformation were not separate but inseparable threads. One of the circuit riders, Peter Cartwright, became famous not only for his fiery sermons but for his rough humor and sheer stamina. He described being thrown from his horse into icy streams, attacked by dogs, jeered by rowdy crowds, and still pressing on. A Methodist preacher in those days, Cartwright later wrote, had to endure hardships like a good soldier. To get through his 200-mile circuit once a month, he had to preach almost every day, and if he did not shout and cry aloud, the people thought him cold. Cartwright told of meetings where men fell like dead men under the mighty power of God, where women shrieked and children trembled. He admitted it was noisy, even chaotic, but to him it was proof of life. "Give me the old Methodist shout," he boasted, "and I will not exchange it for all the elegant silence of the fashionable churches." His words reflected a broader truth. Revival belonged to the people, not to the elites. And this was the world into which Charles Grandison Finney would stride, taking the raw, chaotic energy of the frontier and shaping it into something even larger. Charles Grandison Finney was not raised in the mold of a revivalist. Born in 1792 in Connecticut, he trained for the law, studying cases, argument, and precedent. His mind was sharp, his speech persuasive, his manner confident. But when, in 1821, he knelt in the woods near Adams, New York, overcome with a sudden sense of God's presence, the lawyer became a preacher almost overnight. The Holy Spirit, he later recalled, descended upon me in a manner that seemed to go through me, body and soul. From that moment, he carried the courtroom into the pulpit, treating every sermon as a case to be argued, every sinner as a jury to be swayed. Finney broke from the heavy Calvinism of his day, where older ministers dwelt on predestination, on the inscrutable will of God. Finney thundered that men and women must choose, now, this very moment, to accept or reject salvation. The urgency was relentless. He told listeners that their eternal fate hung not on a distant decree but on their own trembling decision, and he would not let them hide in the back pew. His infamous anxious bench stood at the front, reserved for those under conviction of sin. To step forward and sit there was to expose oneself before neighbors, friends, and strangers, to confess need without word. A farmer's daughter remembered her own terror as Finney fixed his eyes on the crowd, his voice cutting through the tent. "Sinner, you are holding back. Come." She felt her body rise before her mind had resolved, and in a moment she was kneeling in dust, tears soaking the bench. Eyewitnesses wrote of his electrifying presence. When he preached, one recalled, his words seemed to burn their way into the heart. He painted hell in vivid images, flames leaping, chains rattling, sinners stumbling into eternal fire. But just as swiftly he offered visions of mercy, of Christ's open arms, of heaven's gates swinging wide for the penitent. The swing from terror to hope was dizzying, irresistible. Finney knew what he was doing. He used psychology long before the word was in fashion, deliberately arranging services, stacking sermons, organizing music, drawing the crowd step by step toward a breaking point. He once wrote candidly that a revival is not a miracle, nor dependent on a miracle, but it is the right use of the constituted means. To him, revival was something that could be produced if preachers used the right levers. The Spirit worked, but the preacher's duty was to clear the path and press the conscience until it yielded. In Rochester, during the famous revival of 1830-31, whole towns felt seized. Merchants closed their shops for prayer meetings, taverns emptied, courts adjourned for lack of cases, and local newspapers reported crime nearly vanished. A visitor wrote, half awed, half uneasy, "Religion is the great subject of conversation in our city. Meetings are held day and night. The voice of prayer and praise is heard in every dwelling." Where Finney embodied the fiery edge of the awakening, Lyman Beecher represented another strain, less theatrical, but just as influential. Born in 1775, Beecher was already a well-established Presbyterian minister when the new waves of revival began to sweep the country. He believed deeply in conversion, but he also saw religion as the bedrock of public virtue. For Beecher, the great danger was not indifference alone, but vice, alcohol, gambling, Sabbath breaking. His sermons in the early 1820s hammered on temperance, making him one of the first major voices in the movement that would later transform American law. "Intemperance," he warned, "is the sin of our land, and if not arrested, will prove the ruin of our free institutions." For him, revival was never just about saving souls. It was about saving the republic. Beecher's influence stretched beyond his own pulpit. He trained young ministers, wrote widely circulated sermons, and helped knit together a network of clergy who believed revival must be linked with reform. While Finney's meetings often ended in tears and convulsions, Beecher's congregations left with resolutions to abstain from liquor, to educate their children, to build orderly communities. If Finney was the lightning, Beecher was the steady current, channeling revival energy into lasting institutions. For all its diversity, the awakening shared a common core: immediacy. Salvation was not a distant doctrine, but an urgent encounter, a crisis that could seize anyone, anywhere. In a courtroom turned into a chapel, in a forest clearing, in a humble cabin. The old lines of class, education, and formality blurred. Religion had become an affair of the heart, of the body, of tears and shouts and trembling hands. By the mid-1820s, this energy was coursing most fiercely through upstate New York. a region soon nicknamed the Burned-Over District, because so many revivals had passed through that scarcely any fuel seemed left to burn. Towns like Palmyra, Rochester, and Utica saw waves of camp meetings and preaching tours. Families who had once heard a sermon every few months now found themselves surrounded by competing denominations. Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, all crying, "Come and be saved." A traveler through the region in 1826 remarked, "Religion is the common theme of the day. One scarce meets a man who has not been converted or is not under conviction." It was into this atmosphere, raw, democratic, urgent, that new movements would soon emerge. Ordinary people, trained by years of revival to believe that God could speak directly, began to ask whether even the denominations themselves were enough. Some turned to radical reform, others to utopian experiments, still others to visions and prophecies. Out of the smoke and song of the revivals, the Restoration movement under Barton Stone would soon arise, and not long after, in the same soil, the visions of a farm boy named Joseph Smith would claim the mantle of a new dispensation. It was in this atmosphere that the young Joseph Smith grew, surrounded by families who measured their lives by such encounters. The people of the burned-over district of western New York were no strangers to the revivalists' voice. They had heard the circuit riders, read the newspaper accounts, and seen neighbors fall to the ground in tears or leap with joy. Theirs was a world where divine encounter was expected, where heaven and hell were never abstractions, and where a farmer's son might plausibly claim to have seen a vision and be taken seriously, setting the stage for Joseph Smith to step into a world primed for revelation.